You've probably heard stories, maybe even in your own family, about psychic abilities being passed down from one generation to the next. My grandmother had the gift, and so does my aunt. It's a question that's been around forever. But what if I told you that scientists recently took that question out of family folklore and straight into a genetics lab? Well, we're about to break down exactly what they found.
So the whole idea behind this study was, incredibly ambitious. They wanted to see if they could use modern genetics to find an actual physical marker for psychic ability. Could this long-held belief that these traits run in families be traced all the way back to our DNA?
And look, this isn't just speculation. This is a direct quote from the research paper itself. The scientists started with this piece of common wisdom that psychic ability might be hereditary, just like your eye color or your height. And they asked a really simple question. Can we find the proof?
Okay, but that leads to a huge problem right out of the gate. If you want to study the genetics of psychics, well, first you have to find them. And we're not talking about just anyone. You need people who are psychologically healthy, high-functioning, and might actually be able to demonstrate these abilities. Seriously, how do you even begin a search like that?
Well, they started with this many people. Over 3,000 people from all around the globe answered the call. That number alone should give you a sense of just how massive this challenge was. They were literally looking for a needle in a haystack.
And their filtering process was unbelievably tough. From those thousands of applicants, they used questionnaires to check for mental health. Then they ran them through online tasks designed to test for things like precognition. And if they made it past that, they had one-on-one interviews. It was this massive funnel designed to pour thousands of people in the top and have only the most credible subjects trickle out the bottom. So after all that rigorous vetting, who was left? Just 13 people. And a really fascinating profile started to emerge. They were all women, all Caucasian, and all over the age of 37. They tended to report abilities like claircognizance, that's a sense of just psychic knowing, and clairempathy, which is more like psychic feeling. But here's the absolute kicker for this study. 12 out of the 13 said these abilities also ran in their families. That right there really reinforced the whole reason for the study in the first place. Now, to do a proper genetic study, you can't just have one group. You need something to compare them to, a control group. So the researchers found 10 people who matched the psychic group in age, sex, and ethnicity, but who did not claim to have any abilities. And wow, when they compared them, the differences were stark. The psychic cases scored way higher in paranormal beliefs, of course, but also in empathy, sensory sensitivity, and this trait called absorption, which is basically the tendency to get completely lost in an experience. So now they had two very distinct groups. All right, this stage is set. With their two clear groups, the 13 psychic cases and 9 of the controls whose samples were good enough for analysis, the real hunt could finally begin. It was time to look at their DNA, side by side, searching for any tiny little difference that could set them apart. So to really get what they did next, let's use a simple analogy. Think of your DNA as a giant cookbook for how to build, well, you. The most obvious place to look for differences would be in the main recipes, right? The parts that actually give the instructions for building everything, those are the protein-coding genes. And that's exactly where the researchers looked first.
And what do they find? Absolutely nothing. Zilch, nada, a complete dead end. When they compared all those main recipes between the psychics and the controls, there wasn't a single significant difference. For a minute there, it must have seemed like this whole massive effort was a total bust.
But then they found something, and the answer came from a part of our DNA that for a long time scientists kind of dismissed. They even used to call it junk DNA. You see, the clue wasn't in the main recipes at all. It was in what you could call the margin notes of the cookbook, the non-coding DNA. These bits don't build stuff themselves, but they're super important for telling the main recipes when and how to work. And somewhere in all those notes, they found one single, tiny variation that perfectly separated the two groups. So here it is, the big discovery. It's basically a tiny typo, a single letter difference, in a non-coding part of a gene called TNRC18. Get this, all 13 of the psychic cases had the common version of this sequence, which we'll call GG. But 7 out of the 9 controls had a rare version, GA. In this study, that one tiny spot in the genome was a perfect predictor of which group a person was in. I mean, just look at this split. It's absolutely wild. 100%, every single one of the psychic cases had the common GG variant, but in the control group, a totally different picture. Almost 80% of them carried that rarer GA variant, which was completely missing from the psychic group. Okay, so buckle up because this is where the paper takes a turn into some really provocative territory. Finding a genetic link is one thing, but the researchers then went a step further and proposed this bold, really speculative idea to explain why this genetic split might even exist.
They basically asked this massive what-if question. What if major forces in human history, things like culture and religion, have actually been shaping our DNA over thousands of years when it comes to this specific gene?
Their hypothesis kind of breaks down into two parts. First, they suggest that the rise of Christianity, which often suppressed or persecuted people who had psychic-like experiences, might have created a pressure that selected against the psychic GG gene variant. Then second, they propose that modernization, things like better healthcare and sanitation, relax the pressures of natural selection, which allowed the non-psychic GA variant to stick around and spread in developed countries.
And here's the kicker. When they looked at huge genetic databases from around the world, they found a pattern that seemed to support their idea. Populations in countries with longer Christian histories and more modernization tended to have more of that non-psychic GA variant. Now, and this is super important, this is just a correlation. It doesn't prove the theory, but the data does seem to fit their story.
So, let's take a breath here. We have a potential genetic marker, a wild historical theory. What does this all actually mean? It's really important to put this all in the right scientific context, because this is just the very beginning of a much bigger story. Look, the researchers themselves are the first ones to say, hold on a second, this was a pilot study. It was super, super small. What they found is incredibly provocative, but it is not definitive proof. The next crucial step is replication. Other scientists need to do bigger studies with way more diverse groups of people to see if this link to the TNRC18 gene really holds up. But even with all those caveats, this study just leaves you with this incredible, tantalizing question. It's given us the very first potential clue linking our DNA to something as mysterious as psychic ability. And if one tiny spot in our so-called junk DNA can hold a secret this fascinating, what else is just waiting to be discovered inside the vast map of the human genome?